Welcome to the Moynihan Report here on the Two-Way Network. I am, of course, your host, Michael Moynihan. And first up, on Tuesday, May 6th, we'll be teaming up with our friends at FIRE for a special live event at the Village Underground here in New York City. That is part of the great constellation of Comedy Cellar comedy clubs. And I'll be moderating a conversation, occasionally chiming in with my own opinions, about the Trump administration's record on free speech. And we will have Nico Perino, Ilya Shapiro, Lee Rowland, and a few more people that we're going to announce later. Tickets are on sale right now. Find that link in the description of this video. Buy them. There's a limited number of seats, so buy it today. All right, today we're doing something different, a little different. We're doing a May Day show because we're going to pretend that we're European. But I was in Europe recently, and I was in Poland, a country that had been occupied by pretty much everyone for the past 100 years. But up until 1989, it was a Soviet satellite state. And in doing so, everywhere you go in Poland, there are remnants of communism. So we went to the biggest communist project after the war, like late 1940s, early 1950s. The Stalinists created Nowa Huta. What the hell is Nowa Huta? Well, you're about to find out. And in Nowa Huta, it is a model Stalinist city, but it still exists. And some people, maybe they're a bit nostalgic for this stuff. I don't think they should be. All right, so let's watch that now. And when we come back, we're going to talk to New York Times reporter Clay Risen, author of this new book about the Red Scare. So check this out. Poland isn't a normal European country. It's one of the most pro-American countries on earth.
America loves Poland.
It's also one of the most religious. Abortion is illegal, immigration is rare, so it comes as little surprise that its two largest political parties, who loathe each other, are, by any reasonable European definition, both right of center. That's because Poland was a communist vassal state for nearly half a century. It was poor, unfree, and unhappy. And the memory of it is regulated. So we're literally driving in a Trabant.
It looks like a toy.
It looks like a toy. What are the odds that we're going to make it to where we're going without it dying? 70%? Okay. And then there are the young capitalists with no institutional memory of communism who, for a shockingly stiff fee, are there to ferry around curious and credulous bourgeois tourists in a communist-era car, a description I unfortunately match.
The body, it's all plastic.
Let's see if it works. And was taken to Polish communism's model proletarian city. Yeah, I already heard a very strange noise. I wonder how much these cars cost now.
So, late 90s, you could sell it for a bottle of vodka.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted them. Oh, sorry.
Nowa Huta, an orderly suburb of Krakow, began construction in 1949 at the behest of mass murderer Joseph Stalin.
Nowa Huta.
To demonstrate to the world that the flailing and inefficient economic system of the Soviet Union could build a rather attractive Potemkin city.
This is actually the first part of this model
city,
that
yeah.
I'm taking you.
I was going to say, this is starting to look like bad economics.
For many years, people say like Nowa Huta was this younger, more beautiful sister of Krakow. Mm-hmm. So it's supposed to be like a slap on Krakow's face,
yeah.
Which is the bourgeois city, yeah. The intelligentsia, the churches. And that was supposed to be the opposite.
It was a bigger place to buy books about Stalin.
So 70s, when people miss communism, they actually refer to the 70s.
Yeah, okay.
And then 80s was a bit, with Jaruzelski, a bit like a dramatic moment.
Yes, you have martial law.
Yeah,
he's like Roy Orbison meets Mao. The iconography may be criminalized, but communism is everywhere in Poland. Beautiful landscapes interrupted by ugly architectural reminders of the country's totalitarian past. Do you know how to fix this car?
You just had to take a hammer, whack the starter a couple of times.
So I was asking if you could fix it, and you're saying that you would hit it with a hammer.
Yeah, and it was fixing it.
This is why communism lost, I think.
Duct tape, The last few years, people realized actually not everything was bad during communism because the planning, the space, the greenery, the playgrounds, kindergartens, everywhere. Even, have a look, this is bicycle lane from the 50s. Mm-hmm. And we even have underground garages, although there were no cars.
Oh, wow.
For 20, 30 cars at once.
So they had garages, but no cars?
Yeah. You had to wait for a car like a Trabi 10 years.
Oh, that seems reasonable. But this is the main square,
Yeah.
renamed after Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, although he's very liked, he was giving a lot of help to Poland during the 80s. He's famous for Mr. Gorbachev.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But in general, he's like this positive, picture of the help from the West.
This is another thing in Poland. People stop for pedestrians.
Well, we are not so nice as you think. Sędzimira the Huta, so the steel mill.
Yeah.
You can see
It's incredible.
that employed almost 40,000 people in the highest productivity year. So we can say
That's
all
amazing.
men had a
Yeah.
job in the factory. And have a look. In the middle there was of course a monument, and probably you're gonna guess of whom.
I'm going to say it was probably Lenin.
Six-pack Lenin, like ripped,
He's both ripped and fat. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, and he was short and skinny in reality.
Only, yes. And when was it torn down?
89 December.
So very quickly after the end
Very
of
quickly,
communism.
but people tried to knock him down before. 79, there's a famous bomb attack that they wanted to blow him up, but only bit of his shoe was damaged.
In today's Poland, the promotion of communism, the wearing or display of its symbols and icons, is banned by the Polish constitution. But the idea of communism, Poland's ever-present past, infects nearly every debate.
But it's very human quality to over-exaggerate the past as
Correct,
well, yeah?
correct.
So you forget the bad things.
This does look like 1952.
Dzień dobry.
What does that coffee taste like to you?
It's bad.
It doesn't seem to have changed very much, and it still has a very Stalinist vibe. You can see these old guys sitting in the corner drinking coffee. It's exactly the same as it was during the Soviet times, and I'm going to try some of it now.
Here's your speaking coffee.
Oh, wow.
So you have to wait for the bits to...
To go to the bottom.
Yeah.
That you couldn't figure out how to
You
put the...
couldn't travel to see what real coffee is about, and then you
Yeah.
had no comparison, so you're actually very happy with this.
That's horrible. I'm getting shit in my mouth number 2.
These communist napkins, they do no job.
They don't work.
They don't work.
Right.
We call this era the era of propaganda of success, propaganda of prosperity. Look at this lady. I want to show you this lady.
Look how happy she looks.
She is so happy.
Yeah.
She was the person everybody had to be nice to. So it's not like customerism.
Yeah, of course.
Customer is never... Sometimes the lines were just kind of, you had to go very early and just put your name down. She would come back home, prepare the kids to school, she would go to work, and then around 11, 12, she would see if it's her turn now.
So you're spending your whole day thinking about getting food.
So that was annoying. It really made people angry during the 80s because it was like ridiculous. Like the simplest thing, you had to spend hours. On the other hand, there's positive to
Here
it.
she goes again. This is the Stalinist education she got. Yeah.
We say that our parents had way more fun buying inline than we have now online. Because it was also...
I don't know if that's true.
Why?
I don't think that standing in line for a meat ration is as bad as being on Instagram, but I'm not a fan of Instagram, but I'm also not a fan of waiting for meat on the street,
But it was social connections. You still get paid. You didn't have to work hard.
Trying so hard to justify this.
No, of course,
You were
it's
born in the 90s. You think it's okay to say that I wasn't around for this and it would be absolutely fucking horrible
No,
if you
because
were.
I have stories from my family that my parents were like, no, this is when they got married, they're happy times, they got jobs, both of them. And as you were saying, like people were not starving in the 80s. It was very annoying and hard to get food, but people always find a way. And I'm just want to say, like when they look at this photo, some people are like, oh, it was so horrible, everything was bad. But yeah, they did spend time with their neighbors, and there are a lot of funny stories.
I have to say, I'm going to call a timeout. One timeout.
Go ahead.
You are absolutely the loveliest person in the world. This is the craziest idea that you have, that you're waiting in line for food, for rationing, but you get to talk to people.
Yeah.
I talk to people on the subway. I can talk to people. I also don't want to talk to people on the subway, but like you're really trying to find a silver lining there. Not good. This is my political analysis. Not good. There's other ways to hang out with people in your neighborhood.
Yeah, definitely.
But
you know,
you can invite them over for
if you-
coffee, but nobody wants to come because the coffee tastes like shit. And this is the part she hates the most. That's when we won. Sorry, but we won in the end, didn't we?
The good guys, in fact, did win. But even historical victories have to be maintained through robust memory, especially because communism is an undead ideology, perpetually rising from its grave, a grave stuffed with millions of victims to tell the lazy and credulous that this time we'll try it for real, and this time it'll work.
Well, I'll just say thank you so much for this. It was fantastic. I'm worried about your politics. I'm worried that you think that that is the future. It is the past.
Nothing that I said.
No. You want
my
these
words.
kids to live under dictatorship is what you want, because you hate certain buildings. So I won't say it. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was fantastic.
It was a pleasure.
And I hope you get home okay.
Yeah.
I don't think
If
I'm
not,
going There was a book out that I was very excited to get because I buy all books like this. And when there's somebody who's a talented writer and a great reporter for the New York Times named Clay Risen, holy cow, Clay wrote a book. I didn't know he was going to write this book. No one told me about this. Where are your PR people? I'm the guy for this book. And the book is called Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. History is what we're arguing about a lot these days. Joe Rogan, Martyr made these podcasts. So I figured we'd take the opportunity now to talk about the Cold War, to talk about blacklists and stuff that is kind of maybe reoccurring today. Clay alludes to it at the beginning, but we don't have to get into that. We'll go back to the past. Clay Risen, thank you so much for being here. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Buy the book too. I just want everyone to
please.
they end with that. Don't end in case you lose.
Go buy it now.
Go buy it now. Go on Amazon. Buy it now. Let's talk about why you wrote this book. Now I'm reminded of a book called Reds by the writer Ted Morgan.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was weird about it, I was reading this book, and it came out in 2003 or 4 or something like that.
Somewhere. Yeah,
and there was a whole bunch at the beginning and the end about George W. Bush. And it just kind of took me out of the book. And I was like, is this a polemic that is kind of about modern politics? Is that what inspired you to write this book? Or is this a subject of interest?
Yeah, it's just a subject of interest, really. I mean, I had grown up, my grandfather was in the FBI, and I grew up with stories of him they were kind of funny to him, but these sort of pointless loyalty checks and background investigations that he would do. And so that was always kind of in the back of my mind. But also growing up at the tail end of the Cold War, just sort of these echoes. And I've written other books on post-war American history, and the Red Scare is always sort of a cloud on the edge of whatever you're talking about. So it was something that I thought, I'd really like to know more about this. Yeah. And then when I really, started digging in, I mean, Morgan's book aside, there really hadn't been anything in terms of a general public, here is a book about the Red Scare explaining what happened since roughly the end of the Cold War.
There were academic books. And
there have been academic books, but what I wanted to do was say, here's a book that ties together all these things that are part of our cultural currency, cultural political currency, McCarthyism, Blacklists, things like that. And also to try to square the problem that, or the sort of, I guess, move forward the debate that had kind of stopped in the 90s, right? Where you had people who were, and Morgan, I think, is part of this, where they just denied the reality of what communism meant in the United States in terms of espionage, in terms of what the CPUSA was doing. And people kind of went silent on that, and yet I think there was still and
we were getting a whole bunch of new documents and stuff from the Soviet archives,
and
the story was changing in a way.
The story was changing, but there hadn't been a book that said, well, let's take all this into account and try to assess, what does it mean for the government and large parts of the public sphere to go on this mass sort of free speech rampage. In the context of, legitimate challenges to our national security. Yeah.
So in the back of this book, this, by the way, never buy the Kindle. I bought the Kindle because I was excited to read the book and I wanted it ASAP. It was in the middle of nowhere. But then you don't get the blurbs in the back. And I would never make you say anything negative about one of the people who very generously blurbed your book. But this made me think of something because Rachel Maddow blurbed this. And she wrote a book called Prequel, which is a big bestseller about Nazis in America, Nazis who were sympathetic to Nazism within Congress, and I dispute some of this stuff. Some of them are just isolationists. But her argument about her own book, and this is relevant to yours, is that people have underplayed this story, and there's just a small number of them. They're pretty disparate. They weren't connected. And she makes the argument that that's not true. Now, to be honest, I disagree with that. But how do you see that when it comes to communism? Because what Maddow's book talks about the sedition trials, and those were absolute disasters for civil liberties. These people have really repugnant, shitty ideas, not isolationists. These are people that are anti-Semites, that are pro-Nazi, they want the Nazis to win, et cetera. And some of them go to jail for this. But we say, well, you know, they were the bad guys. The Cold War history, we seem to have a different take on this. But it seems to me that it was far more influential in the sense that it actually penetrated certain areas of the government, of the Roosevelt administration, and then ultimately the atomic bomb program, et cetera. How do you place this when you say, okay, loyalty tests were crazy. There were people that were going way over the top about this, but was it significant in your mind that there was some there?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think part of the story that I try to tell, or I hope comes across, is that there's something tragic about this, right? And that, yes, it was necessary to button up security. It was necessary to push back against the Communist Party in the United States. But the ways in which it was done were poorly. The methods were poorly chosen. I think, you know, Harry Truman thought that he was doing something that would just be a rubber stamp, and it ended up being incredibly invasive.
As you point out in the book, that he was slightly apologetic about it in his own memoor.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because he was trying to buy off Hoover, and, you know, this was after the 1946 midterms where the Republicans shellacked the Democrats in part on security. And so this was sort of a sop to that, but it was done in this very open-ended way that allowed all kinds of violations to happen. So, you know, that's where I think, you know, this is sort of tragic. Like the country, there's something about American political culture, maybe it's just the way that we think about national security versus free speech, but we tend to overreact, and we don't have a very good, and maybe this is true for everybody. I mean, there's something about human nature, I think, where we in normal times say free speech is great, freedom of association is very important, but oftentimes we're very quick to throw that away when there's some sort of justification.
What was that justification? I mean, you look back and there's a lot of infiltration of particularly the Roosevelt administration. You make a point, which I think is often overlooked by people, and it's all kind of conflated. But in the 30s, that's when it was at its thickest point, right?
Right.
The infiltration was very real. There were a number of people within the State Department, Treasury, who were literally passing secrets to the Soviets. And this is before we were, allies of convenience during the war. And, Hollywood is making a couple of 3 very, very prominent pro-Soviet movies. And, the McCarthyism era, which is later, the threat is much diminished, right? The party, the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, is much diminished. So, talk about that difference, because there is a real problem in the early part of this Cold War. Well, before the Cold War. Actually.
No, sure. And that's also the irony of this, right? Is that we only paid attention to the threat once it was largely gone.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that the Rosenbergs didn't deserve to be tried. I don't think they deserve to be executed, but they were guilty.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. They were guilty, though.
Absolutely. Alger was guilty, but the things he did were in the 30s by and large. I mean, there wasn't, I'm sure his allegiances remained what they were, but, we were talking about things that happened. The reason why he was found guilty for perjury and not espionage was because it had all passed the statute of limitations. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is all stuff that happened at a time when the Roosevelt administration, and honestly, the government writ large, was just not paying that much attention. And I'm wary of one thing that some I'd say apologists do, is they say, well, look, the stuff that was handed over, aside from nuclear secrets and a few other items, were largely not valuable, right? The stuff that Hiss gave was not valuable. And I'm wary for two reasons. The first is that, what's not interesting to us may be very interesting to a spy master.
Yeah.
Knowing bits and pieces of a puzzle piece on its own is not interesting, but when it plugs into other puzzle pieces. So you never know what is of value. And the other thing is it shouldn't diminish the fact that it existed to say, well, they didn't really turn over anything of value. There was a spy network of hundreds of people, and who knows what that could have led to.
In very prominent positions in some
and
cases.
but I think the important thing to take away is that, it did start to collapse, the Soviet espionage effort, and it collapsed because the Soviet Union had its own internal politics. The purge, the Stalinist purge, had a big impact on just their capacity. They also had real doubts about that first wave of spies or people in the government who were handing stuff over. They were ideologues. And, you take a guy like Whittaker Chambers, and, he wasn't in the government, but he was in the operation. And he was
the American Soviet spy who exposed Alger Hiss.
Yeah, and he was a courier, but he knew the networks, but he was in it for ideological reasons.
For sure.
And most of them were like that.
Yeah.
And the Soviets got to a point where they realized that's not what we want. These people maybe they're useful, but oftentimes they're blinded. Maybe they turn, like Hiss turned, and he turned against communism and the Communist Party aggressively. And so, the Soviets pulled back because they wanted a restart and to start to cultivate a different kind of network that was more transactional, more based on people that they could really control in the long term. And so anyway, so it's interesting that the Red Scare hits at a time when Soviet espionage was on the wane.
Yeah.
And yet, because of the onset of the Cold War and because of the vagaries of domestic politics, it made sense to make a big deal of it at that time.
I mean, it's interesting, too, is that things that I don't think most Americans know. One thing you point out in your book that is largely unknown is that HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, started with the mission of finding Nazi spies, Nazi collaborators and saboteurs. And one of the main people on that committee was himself a Soviet spy, Samuel Dickstein.
Yes, yeah.
And there are very few of these, but Dickstein is one of the ones who didn't do it for ideological reasons.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
His Soviet cover name was Crook.
Yeah,
because he was negotiating more and more money.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's also probably largely unknown that the vice president of the United States was essentially a Soviet sympathizer in Henry Wallace.
Yeah.
And there's some debate about this. I am one of the ones. Wallace does change at the end of his life, one of these people who actually says, maybe I got some things wrong.
Yeah,
but as you point out, runs for president in 1948. Talk to me about this. This is the thing that irks me, is that let's talk about Hollywood, because everyone knows this. Everyone knows about the Blacklist. Everyone knows about the Hollywood 10. Movies have been made about it. Documentaries have been made about it. Not a single one of them that I can find that is even remotely critical. I mean, it's usually laudatory. And these guys stood up for human rights and civil liberties, which is, in my estimation, partially true. A lot of these guys, when you think of somebody like Dalton Trumbo, the director, there's a film made about him. Who played him?
Bryan Cranston.
Bryan Cranston. The guy from Breaking Bad, playing Dalton Trumbo. And Trumbo is this kind of heroic figure. And if you go back and look at Trumbo's opinions about the Soviet Union, about Stalin, it's like, well, this is not a guy, like a lot of these people, who really cared much about civil liberties and how they operated in the place that they deified, which was the Soviet Union. This is a place where there was no civil liberties and people were being executed for purge trials that a lot of these people supported. I mean, so how do you square that in the sense that they came out of this in so many ways as the heroes of the 20th century, the ones that stood up? And I agree, by the way, just be clear about this. The government has no business in telling Hollywood who can be writing films and making films. It's ridiculous. But I was always uncomfortable with this idea that they were this paragon of liberty and civil rights when they supported governments and ideologies that weren't.
Yeah, I think you have to look at it case by case because, and over the course of, let's say, I mean, you pick a time period, but, someone like, I think Trumbo's opinions varied from moment to moment and or over the course of
You could say someone like
several
Lillian
years.
Hellman is a good example.
Sure,
too,
Lillian Hellman. I mean, she's one where I think gets a lot more credit than probably is due.
She's a rotten writer and a rotten I'm sorry. And
No,
as Mary McCarthy said about her, every word she says is a lie, including and the.
Yeah.
Which is, I think is right.
No, and she was lauded for taking the diminished, saying I will talk about my communist beliefs or my alleged beliefs, but I'm not going to talk about anybody else, and that was lauded as a stand. That other people took as well, but because she said it in a certain way, she gets credit. Or John Howard Lawson is another one who just,
He was a real fanatic.
Was a real fanatic, and was one of the relatively few people in Hollywood who was really out about his communism.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people were secret, or they just didn't talk about it. And he was one who stayed. A lot of people, they came, like Trumbo, came into the party for a period of time, and then they were turned off by, maybe they were energized for a while, and then turned against it. And I think this is one of the things, I mean, I guess my view, I sort of align with some of the guys in the Americans for Democratic Action, where, they were strongly anti.
It's a liberal group that opposed the party.
But, their view, which aligned with some of the, let's say, more centrist conservatives in Hollywood, like Ronald Reagan, at the time, a centrist conservative.
Yeah, I mean,
he was on his own.
As you point out.
He was on his own trip.
Yeah, his testimony was pretty centrist.
But their point was, look, this is something it doesn't have deep roots. Yeah. And it is an ideology that can be combated in the public sphere. It can be, we can talk about how it's a failure. What we don't need is sort of oppressive measures from the government or from, whole industries saying, we're not going to talk about this, or we're not going to let these people have their say and then debate them and prove them wrong.
It's an American tradition in the sense that, Maddow's book is about the reaction, or I think in her case, the reaction she wished had happened, which was even more aggressive than it actually was against Nazism. This, of course, against communism after 9/11, against Islamism and stuff. And we tend to have these reactions. I mean, what is the difference that you see in the reaction of the Cold War against, Dalton Trumbo and filmmakers? Look, I have zero respect for Dalton Trumbo. I don't know why. I'm just irrational. I'm a Dalton Trumbo hater. And I am actually somebody who really loves Elia Kazan, and I think he was really unfairly treated.
Yeah.
But, and that's for you out there who don't know, the person who made On the Waterfront and named names, which I have some problems with that characterization of what he said. But what is the difference with all of these things? I mean, this seemed to have lasted longer, right? I mean, it went for a while, but then again, what is the backlash then? Because in the 1960s, you have people, David Horowitz died yesterday.
Yeah.
The communist Stalinist thinker, he was a red diaper baby, became very right-wing. As a friend of mine said, he was crazy in his youth and he was crazy in his old age too. But in the 1960s, early 60s, he was writing books from this new left perspective, one called Free World Colossus about American foreign policy. And, editing Ramparts. I mean, it changed kind of quickly, right? Like these people are openly flying, Ho Chi Minh flags, NLF flags, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is going to win. I mean, that's a period of what, 10 years?
Yeah. I mean,
How does that happen?
Well, I think, I think there are, two things, right? First is that there's just a general public reaction against the strictures of the Red Scare. And not just the Red Scare, but, the general culture of the early mid-50s, right? And, it was in a lot of ways, stultifying uniform culture with lots of subcultures that you can celebrate. But that was not what was seen as the dominant culture. And so, people that were raised in that came out of it with a reaction against it. And I think a reaction that was rooted in the fact, you look at how one of the ways that baby boomers or, people like Horowitz talked about their childhood was, why didn't you tell us these things? Why didn't you tell us about civil rights? Why didn't you tell us about American imperialism or whatever they wanted to call it? And well, one of the reasons was because teachers in the early 50s were strongly discouraged from talking about critical points of view about American history.
And then when you see that the Communist Party is supporting the Scottsboro Boys and talking about sort of racial unity, which I think was if you read Richard Wright on this in The God That Failed, I think was mostly a smokescreen, but they were talking about it.
Yeah, well, and people associated it.
Yeah, sure.
Whether rightly or wrongly in their minds, the Communist Party. But it went the other way too, so that segregationists would say, talking about the only people talking about civil rights are communists. Ergo, if you talk about civil rights, you're a communist.
And ergo, Martin Luther King is a communist.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the New York Times, we were under attack from the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee because after we endorsed Brown versus Board of Education, or we endorsed.
You do have one enormous black mark when it comes to communism, though.
Okay.
Walter Duranty. You got to say that was that's of course 20 years before, and it's nothing to do with that. But Walter Duranty. But that's not what the committee was going at. I just want people to know that if you don't know who Walter Duranty is, the great thing now is you have a phone, you can Google it quickly. But he was the Times Moscow correspondent during the Ukrainian famine, and Agnieszka Holland did a film about this actually recently, which is quite good. About Duranty's a major character in it. I'm sorry, I don't want to attack your employer. But that one they should be attacked for.
Yeah,
and he won the Pulitzer Prize too.
It's funny. We've tried to give that Pulitzer Prize back, and they will not take it.
Hold on. Is that true? Because I have heard so many criticisms that the New York Times refuses to give up the Pulitzer Prize, but the Times, you're saying, has tried to give it back, and the Pulitzer Committee says no?
Yeah, I mean, it's a designation.
Okay.
So, there's it's
not hanging on the wall of your office or something, right?
Well, it is actually.
It is.
What we have the Pulitzer Wall.
Yeah.
It's a hallway. And next to his, or most of them, they're just a photo of one of their stories and them. And, but there's a whole explanation. There's a plaque that says, here's what Walter Duranty did. And here's what, we own up to.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
it's the only one, as far as I know.
Yeah.
I
want to say that I don't think anyone at the Times would defend Walter Duranty's reporting today. But that is definitely a part of the history of the New York Times.
No, it is. But anyway, so going back to communism being this sort of all-encompassing slur for a wide range of ways of thinking.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, the ultimate kind of cultural takeaway of this era, right?
Yeah.
Is that any kind of, let's say, progressive thinking became verboten and or suspect for a period. And so then in the 1960s, when a new generation comes along, they look back at that and they say, you were hiding things from us. It was almost this reaction against, or
it was kind of a punk rock position to take. Right?
Yeah, well, of course, and anti-establishment, and my parents or whatever, they either they raised me in certain conditions so that I see how everyone else was treated. If you were a red diaper baby, you look at the world through a very particular lens, or you grew up in a world where maybe you just weren't exposed to certain ideas.
Bill Ayers' his father, the Weather Underground terrorist, his father was, I think he ran the Chicago Power and Light Company or something like that. Yeah, these people that come from these backgrounds. It's interesting because there are these patterns. I remember when I studied history in college, what my slightly useless degree is in, but I remember having a conversation with a girlfriend at the time who, would debate me on everything. But this was the one, she's like, what is the use of a history degree? She was like pre-med, and I said, there are reasons for it. I'll figure it out and explain it later. It's just the easiest thing and what I'm interested in. But the thing that is, we don't pay, the echoes are, it's always the same thing. If you look at the most recent version of this, wokeness, right? This is something I railed against early on because I was living through it in these ways. And then I turned around and said, look at all these Elizabeth Dillings And again, that's one for you guys to look up at home. I can't explain all these people. Read a book called Red Channel. She was a housewife. She was crazy. Called everybody a communist. And that's everybody now is that, we got to get Jackie Robinson's picture off the wall of the Defense Department because it's DEI. this kind of stuff where there is a concern.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's Dwight McDonald's on the left. And, there's all these, Sidney Hook and all these great liberal anti-communist intellectuals. And then it becomes all these dopes saying Martin Luther King's a communist, everybody who disagrees is a communist. I mean, these historical echoes are pretty obvious. This happens quite a bit.
Yeah, and this is sort of what I was getting at earlier. It's just we have this inability to confront complicated challenges or obstacles or, whatever, however you want to characterize it, with the nuance they require.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and look, I mean, we're a free market country. We're people. There are intellectual entrepreneurs who see ways to build up a brand around whatever the thing is of the moment, and they're not really incentivized to be nuanced. And
and the right doing this on the commie stuff, and the left doing it too.
Of course,
when you see that, I was taught in school. I mean, we're probably of a similar age cohort. I was taught in school for sure that the Rosenbergs were railroaded, that Sacco and Vanzetti were railroaded. Sorry, guys. Massachusetts, my home, say Italian-American. I want to be, they're, at least Sacco's definitely guilty. I just got to say, I'm a revisionist on that. But that is the revisionist position. So it pushed often in the other direction also. So the stultifying 50s, right?
Yeah.
That parents, and they were terrible, and we're rebelling against it. When I was growing up, it was all kind of, McCarthy was a fantasist only.
Right.
Which, I mean, he was a bad guy in a million ways. Hiss was innocent.
Right.
Rosenbergs were innocent, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so it kind of does swing back and forth.
Oh, of course,
right?
Absolutely, and they don't. Well, it swings back and forth, but not. It's more like, I'm not going to get a good metaphor here, but different swings moving in different speeds. I mean, for example, I did a book event a few weeks ago with a pretty good crowd. I mean, let's say 60 people, and it was an older crowd. Not to characterize folks, but the moderator asked at one point. Hiss came up, and he said, "Does everyone know who Alger Hiss was?" And I'd say 2/3, a little more, hands went up, and they said, "How many people think he was guilty?" All the hands went down. I mean, there were maybe three. I mean, my hand was up, his hand was up. There were maybe 3 or 4 others. It's like, but is that a reflection of any kind of learning on their part, or is it just what they've been taught?
I think it's more. It's also a direction, right? It's like a directionally, I don't want to be on that side.
Right. Yes. Exactly. And that happens too. And so it's I think today, and I've had this conversation with historian friends of mine who uniformly like, oh, of course he's guilty. Of course he was. And we talk about the details and all that, but there's no question. And yet in the public is not quite there as well. And so I think that
if
happens.
they even remember it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a separate, the historical amnesia is another thing. But I think, the movement, the swing back and forth, whether it's on a particular, historical questions or just broader sort of cultural movements back and forth, it's a messy process.
Yeah.
And so, but I think it's interesting to look, as you said, it's sort of at DEI or whatever today, wokeness, and compare that to the 40s and 50s. Because I think the kernel, you're absolutely right, that there's a conversation to be had. There's an issue of concern. In the 40s and 50s, it was a real security concern. Yeah. Today, it's, I mean, I don't know, it's not a concern, but it's not like the country's going to end if people say their pronouns. But anyway, it's something that people are activated about. But we just, instead of having those nuanced conversations, we just railroad through it.
Well, I mean, I think one of the comparisons is, and you can actually say this without getting ideological or political, is that nobody anticipates when they're winning a debate the backlash that is going to not only destroy their position but keep destroying in a different direction. So, I mean, the communism was culturally doing quite well in the 1930s. There were many significant people that were, pro-Soviet, or if not pro-Soviet, they were supporting a lot of front groups and fellow travelers. They were supporting the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. And then the response to that is you get McCarthyism, everybody's a commie. The response to that is a kind of new left, maybe Ho Chi Minh should win that. The response to that is Reaganism. And you keep going through all of these, now with Trump, it's like these people said we had to live through this horrible DEI stuff, and I could filter my businesses on Amazon by race, which is something that I find abhorrent myself. But this is something that the response to this is to destroy the institutions, destroy the universities, because this is the incubator of bad ideas. And I think that, like, when people talk about, the Cold War and McCarthyism, it's like the instincts of it, they're with everybody. They're with every side, and everybody's going to, ultimately destroy their own cause when they get too ideological and too fervent about it.
Well, I think it's when, they get ideological and fervent, but also over their skis, or not over their skis. I think when you have a movement or a moment that sees the opportunity to go after something bigger than the immediate cause, right? So wokeness, or the war on woke or whatever, is, I think, an excuse for some people to go after even bigger fish. You don't have to tear down the university system in order to reduce the influence of DEI on, right? But if your goal is something much bigger, right, is a full-throated ideological deconstruction of higher education, well, that's a bigger target than.
Isn't that what people said about communism?
Yeah, sure.
And that was the idea, was that it's the long march to the institutions, right? To change the institutions, sort of subtly over time. The reason for hearings about Hollywood was that they're putting these messages in because they want to destroy us internally.
Yeah,
to heighten the
reality is that
right?
didn't really happen.
There was some element of it, right?
Yeah, yes, but it's not like communists controlled Hollywood and were every movie that came out was full of these subtle messages.
Yeah.
And if you look at the backlash against that, like the way that Ayn Rand constructed her manifesto list of rules about what constitutes an anti-communist movie, it's like, well, don't celebrate.
By the way, just for people to know, is that Ayn Rand, you of course know her from The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Prior to writing those books, she was a screenwriter in Hollywood.
She was, yeah. She had written Atlas Shrugged, maybe by that point. She had one of her first books,
which I think became a movie with Gary Cooper.
Yeah. So she was, she was in that mix.
Yeah.
But she set the tone for not just sort of removing whatever communist influence was there, but a real, I'd say, a construction of a different kind of ideological movie. In terms of very pro-capitalist, you need to celebrate capitalists in all your movies. Mm-hmm. You need to, I'm reminded. I talk about it just glancingly in the book, but the movie "The Best Years of Our Lives," which is forgotten today, is a pretty good movie. But at the time when it came out,
immediately post-war,
and it's very, for the time, very critical of the way that the country, as a home front, dealt with soldiers coming home, and very critical of war profiteering. It was saying things at a time when, it's almost a throwback to some of the better social movies of the 30s. But it came out, won a bunch of Academy Awards, had a bunch of stars in it. A couple of years later, Lillian Ross went to Hollywood for The New Yorker and was interviewing, sort of looking at the immediate sort of post-HUAC, post-Blacklist Hollywood. And somebody said, look, we could never make that movie today in 1948. 1946, we could make it. Today, we cannot make it. Because if you look at it, that movie, and today, if you watch it, it's very soft. By our standards, very soft. But it violates Ayn Rand's rules, like 10 of her 12 or whatever. It's you can run down the list. And it's just it's striking how dramatic and over the top that change was.
Yeah. The 30s, you see a lot of films that maybe are not explicit, like even Philadelphia Story, which I think was a Donald Ogden Stewart who wrote that, I think.
That's right.
But, there's kind of lefty themes in these movies. Mm-hmm. What was the kind of how did the mechanics of it work after the blacklist? A lot of these writers, I mean, you can blacklist a director and they can't work. You blacklist a writer, they become very clever and write under assumed names and, you know, go to foreign countries and do stuff there. I mean, how serious was it a violation of civil liberties? And, you know, the people that went to jail as a result of this, it was because they refused to testify. Right. Which I think is horrible on its own way, because they shouldn't have to testify about these things. But the blacklist was broken not pretty quickly, but it didn't last a decade, right? It lasted less than that.
It lasted a little. I mean, it sort of depends on where you put your finger on it.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'd say easily a decade. Yeah. And it depended. It didn't. There was no, because there was no literal blacklist. You know, there was no list of people.
Yeah.
There was no way to end that. So it was much more kind of a mode, or like just a vibe that shifted. So individual directors willing to, or individual studios willing to go out and put someone's name on a project when maybe someone else wouldn't. And so there was that sort of, you know, it wasn't like the fall of the wall. It was gradual until it got to a point where, you know, people were pretty comfortable with saying, yeah, you can work on this project.
Would a blacklist be, I want to say okay, but say more understandable in a way, if the government wasn't involved, in the sense that, you know, there are people that always accuse Hollywood of having a blacklist for, you know, in the 1980s and 90s, always conservative directors, conservative actors. We can't get the roles because they don't like our politics.
Well, I think there's a very fine line, right? Where there are, and I'm not endorsing this, but you could say, well, is it okay to have people who are considered sort of vaguely distasteful, right, that we don't want to work with? The blacklist was something else. I mean, to say there wasn't a literal list doesn't, and I'm not trying to diminish I mean, it was practically an anti-competitive action. The studios talked to each other, and they understood, like, I'm not going to hire this guy. You don't hire this guy. There were bodies of, you know, whether it was the American Legion and sort of self-defined kind of grand inquisitors whose job it was to make sure that you are not going to hire these people, right? And if you don't, I mean, if you do, we're going to protest. We're going after you.
Yeah.
And that's very different from kind of a whisper network where, you know, people say, I don't want to hire that guy. You know, if someone did, it's not the end of the world, right? In the analogy of 80s or 90s. The blacklist was much harsher and much more thorough in its.
Do you have a number of how many people ended up being sort of blacklisted? Because I know there's obviously not a list.
I mean, this is right.
But there are people that I think sometimes claim it.
Well,
that's a little skeptical.
Yeah.
Of,
well, and that's the challenge. I don't, you know, I mean, it's very hard to. You could say, well, look, there were books that, you know, that came out that had lists that were not the same as the blacklist, but, you know, they were. ABC was American Business Consultants, which is a great name, right? Which is different from ABC, the network. Yes. But they were some ex-FBI guys who saw the opportunity to entrepreneur themselves into being essentially the arbiters of the blacklist. And they put out books and newsletters that said...
Red Channels, which I mentioned earlier, itself was its own blacklist.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that didn't track one-to-one with everybody. There were people who were not in the books who were blacklisted. There were people in the books who weren't. But, you know, maybe it's rough. So that, you know, they probably named a couple of thousand people over the course of, you know, I don't know, 10 years that they were in operation. But... I'm reminded of there's an anecdote that I have in the book where this guy who is not a famous actor, he says, you know, I one day I just stopped getting work, and I was convinced that it was because I don't know, I'd sort of over the hill. I wasn't a good actor, and people didn't want me. That happens all the time. I was so relieved to find out that I'd been blacklisted, and, you know, like, I don't know, was he? I think, you know, but because there's no way of knowing, and it would be this sort of thing where Walter Bernstein, who's another guy in the book, he was a screenwriter who was blacklisted, and he only found out because a studio executive who liked him took him to, you know, said, meet me in this bar. 11 o'clock tomorrow, we're, back in a corner so no one can see us. And he told him, like, you're on the blacklist. But it was that sort of, it was even supposed to be secret from Bernstein. Like, he wasn't supposed to know.
Is there a political limit in which you would accept a blacklist?
I mean, I guess it would depend on what.
Somebody's a member of a kind of Nazi-ish group or a sympathetic group. And
for me,
Groyper, I guess that's what we call them now. Groypers, is that a real thing? Is that still a fucking thing? But the Nick Fuentes types. But like, if you have somebody who is a fascist or fascist leanings, or at that time maybe supported the other side of the Spanish Civil War, the Franco cause, I mean, would that be acceptable?
To me personally?
Yeah, because I suppose if it's you personally, that you would say that morally that it's okay.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm fairly, fairly invested, fairly bullish on the idea that, we don't need a blacklist to decide which ideas are valuable or persuasive and which are not. And I'm also, I mean, particularly in the context of Hollywood, as opposed to something like writers or speakers who are kind of just out there on their own. If you're whoever you are in Hollywood, you're part of a system. I mean, every movie is financed by people with a lot of money. Every movie has it's got a director, you've got a writer. The idea that the writer is going to somehow shape everything about a movie is ridiculous. And so it depends, I guess, on the industry. But again, I'm not sure that there would be a context where I would feel comfortable endorsing a blacklist.
No, I mean, the reason I ask, I mean, obviously, as I said, the government element is very different. I mean, the government gets involved, having hearings where they have no business to be, pulling private citizens in a private industry in front of, like, I get that there was a point, the war effort, that the government was rather involved. I mean, Jack Warner both said that FDR made him make Mission to Moscow, and then he had nothing to do with it. So there's a lot of stories about this stuff. And that's an intertwining of the government and the industry. But yeah, I guess the thing I can point of other little things where these maybe mini blacklists happen. And look, you and I discussed before you were recording, I guess our mutual friend, Ron Radosh, you're friends with Ron, who's a great historian himself, an ex-commie, little turn to the right, and wrote a book with his wife, Alice Radosh, which I recommend people get. It's very good, called Red Star over Hollywood. And it is mentioned in that book and some other books that there was a bit of a blacklist for non-communist writers and people who resisted the party and the party line. And they would, Trumbo, Ron has written about this, was like, we keep that guy out of working because he's not one of us.
Yeah. And some, even at the HUAC hearings, some of the friendly witnesses talked about that. And yeah, sure. I mean, and that in the way that they described that, that experience felt very contemporary, right? Because in that case, it's not like the studios were telling these individuals they can't work in Hollywood, but it was the whisper network of, a director maybe shouldn't hire this actor or, whatever, because they have conservative views. Yeah. Right. Which feels more like what we experienced, say, over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it happens a lot in journalism to people who, and I know this just from doing the show that I've done, not this show, which is better than the other show. No, it's not better. The Fifth Column that I do, we get a lot of stuff from journalists. This is particularly in 2017, 18, 19, who were like saying, "Oh, we like your show." I'm like, "What are you whispering? This is a totally normal. I have completely normal centrist views. I am probably in a lot of views to the left of people on average in the U.S., maybe to the right on some. But there was this sense in journalism at certain times that maybe I shouldn't be too public about my views because I probably won't get to be put on certain stories. Absolutely. Don't mention it in editorial meetings. It's just not going to make your life easy. So I think there's always a kind of blacklist mentality that exists in everybody about views that they disagree with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's especially, I've not worked in every industry in the world, but I think it's true in some more than others in journalism, certainly. Yeah. I gather in Hollywood, and others.
Yeah,
Probably-
so I hear, but I don't know
Yeah.
that for myself.
Yeah.
All right, we have someone who wants to ask a question. We always do that at the end of the show, but I like to sometimes end on this unbelievably boring and cliche question, which I do ask because it always comes with interesting answers. Is that this is a long process of researching a book that is this big and thorough. It's not big. It's not like you can breed it. It's not. It's not crazy. It's that. It's don't go buy it. Don't get scared. But there's got to be things in here that kind of knock your socks off, and things, the things that surprise you, because I'm constantly being surprised. You mentioned somebody who I want to do something on because his story knocked my socks off, and we don't have time to talk about it, but Howard Rushmore, who was a former communist and was fired, this is a great story, was fired from the Daily Worker, where he was the film critic, because he gave a positive review to Gone with the Wind. And in response, he becomes the editor of Confidential magazine, becomes an insane anti-communist, so much so that he applies for a job with Joe McCarthy, and he's like, this guy's a bit crazy. And then in that last frame of his life, he's in a cab going uptown on the Upper West Side, having a fight with his younger girlfriend, shoots her in the head, kills her, and then shoots himself in the head.
Right.
And it's the cover of the Daily News, which back in the day, I think that people censored this stuff. There is a shot of the death scene in the back of the cab, and that is one of those stories that I come across, and I'm like, Jesus, there's so many millions of interesting little stories. Was there anything in this book that was like, wow, that's something I didn't know, or something that you misunderstood, or?
I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of little trivia that I left out. Like, I was surprised at the number of Quakers that pop up in my story.
Of Quakers?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, Hiss and his wife were Quakers.
Oh, that's right. They were.
For a time, Chambers was a Quaker. Nixon was a Quaker. I mean, it's not relevant really, except it is relevant in one place. And there's a famous story where at one point, Nixon, one of the ways that Nixon, who was very skeptical of Chambers at the beginning, one of the things that made Nixon come around, because he's a Quaker, and at one point Chambers said, or Nixon was asking, like, how well did you know them? And he goes, well, I met Priscilla a number of times, and they always used the plain speech. And Nixon goes, oh wait, you know what that is? It's a thee and thou, and sort of a stilted older.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's an insight that only somebody who's real. First of all, I think he trusted him more because he was Quaker, or at least understood Quaker world.
Sure.
But also that's not something everybody would know.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something that I can kind of find out. I can investigate. Is that true about Hiss? Because you also might not know that if you just knew him publicly.
Yeah.
Because Chambers was saying, well, that's in their home. That's how they would talk.
I think what is great and what I appreciated in this book is those sketches, and I've seen them before, but the sketches of weird elements that actually change people's minds on things. For instance, the kind of frumpy and rumpled look of Whittaker Chambers, the fact that his teeth were decayed, and and then next to Hiss, who looks like what he was, a member of the sort of waspy elite. And it is important. Small things in history are incredibly important, like voices, right? The fact that he had a plummy sort of mid-Atlantic accent, I think to a lot of people made them think, well, he couldn't be. This is
right.
This is the same thing is true, and there's a book about it by this Ben McIntyre, who's like a popular historian, wrote a book about the Cambridge spies, and that is the case with them too, is that they're no way they'd be traitors to their class, because all of these spies went to Oxford. And these small little details of history are, when we had discussed this Douglas Murray debate with on Joe Rogan, and one thing I said to, I know a mutual friend of ours, is that the people who said Douglas Murray lost that debate really hate his voice. And they hate the plumminess of his voice and the way he speaks, and that he speaks well.
Yeah.
It was another thing that why people hated William F. Buckley too, is that there's so many of these things that are like exogenous factors outside of what we think about politics that make people's minds up,
Absolutely. But it went the other way too, where Hiss and Adlai and Dean Acheson, were also hated by Midwesterners. I mean, they were seen as, because they embodied that worldview.
The State Department world,
right?
yeah.
Well, in this
What
sort
did Nixon
of,
call them? The striped pants brigade.
Yeah, they wore bespoke English suits, and they had they spoke with that.
Yeah.
And so it cut both ways, and I think so much of the Red Scare was cultural and a conflict between
cultures.
Between several different cultures at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I hate the fact that we are up against time, because this is when we get super nerdy and weird.
We're not super nerdy
I think
already.
we've been doing that for a while now. But no, these kinds of things, particularly as it pertains to the Trump culture wars and the deification of the working class and that kind of stuff, is very similar. Jason, we have somebody out there. Paul is out there in Zoom land and wants to ask a question. Paul, I can hear you. How's it going, buddy?
How's it going? How you doing? First thing I would say is you should watch that Ayn Rand on the House of Un-American Committee. She had the best description of communism I've ever heard, where it was like, I don't know, it was a really good speech. But pretty much the most we talk about a lot of this World War II post the order, the Bretton Woods.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about Harry Dexter White? How he's they call him a Soviet spy, and all these things about the post World War II order was based on this Soviet spy negotiating this agreement. And and also Nixon ended it because it was consequent. We couldn't pay the gold anymore, and I wonder how much was it designed in such a way to be a failure.
Clay, before I go to Clay on this one, I just want to congratulate you, and I just want to say that we have the greatest listeners in the world. What a bunch of nerds you guys are, in the best way. Someone calls in to ask about Harry Dexter White, which is I'm interested. You're going to talk about the Amaration spy case next.
Yeah.
These are the nerdy things that we love you for. Very much appreciate it. I'll also add that Hiss was at Yalta. But what do you make of that? Because there has been, a lot of conspiracy theory about that stuff. I don't hold Harry Dexter White in very high esteem. I know there's been some debate about how close he was to the Soviet apparatus. But what do you make about that kind of influence, that people that were within FDR and the New Deal kind of superstructure were then making kind of policy after the war. And, the conspiracy is that they give everything away at Yalta. They don't really care about Stalin. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I don't put too much credence in it, with all due respect. I think, look, there's no question in my mind that Harry Dexter White was compromised and, had a lot to answer for. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything he touched was a reflection 100% of the Soviet agenda, right? And also he was not the sole architect of anything. Yeah. So, where that influence came in, how it actually manifested, I think some of that's beyond my pay grade. But I'd be skeptical of anything that made a broad claim about that sort of influence.
Well, Clay Risen, I want to thank you so much. And this is the book, Red Scare, Blacklist, McCarthyism and the Making of Modern America. Go out and buy it. Support your local bookstore. If you got to go to Amazon, do that too. I do it all the time. And by the way, I love this history nerd stuff. And if you do too, it's Michael at twoway.tv. Send me a message, because I think we should probably do something soon about modern Russia, and maybe some more of you will prick up your ears and say, well, that's relevant. But I want to thank all of you for joining us, and thank Clay for joining us, and read his book. It's terrific. And if you hadn't noticed this, you're watching this on a brand new Moynihan Report YouTube channel. Subscribe to it. Just do all the stuff that you're supposed to do. Smash the button, smash the computer, do whatever you have to do. But we're over there now, and we're on our own little island, so come join us. And you don't want to miss any episodes. And we got one coming up on Tuesday with my old pal from Vice, Thomas Morton. And if you watch the Vice on HBO show, he was the best correspondent. He was the funniest. No disrespect to the other ones. He was phenomenal. And we're going to talk about his new documentary, charting the journey of Gavin McInnes from starting Vice magazine to starting the Proud Boys. And he was very important in Thomas's life, and Thomas wanted to know what happened. So he made a documentary, which has, I think, gotten some award or nominated some big award in Canada. It was CBC, the Canadian public broadcaster, that broadcast it. So we'll be talking about that, and that'll be on Tuesday, the same night, by the way, if you're in New York City, that you can come to our event at the Village Underground. All the information's below in the link. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on Tuesday.